I was never one to believe in ghosts or hauntings, but after what happened last night, I can't go back to that farm. I had to leave everything behind. The tools, the truck, even my damn wallet. There's no way I'm stepping foot on that land again. It was supposed to be an easy night. The old farm I'd inherited had been left untouched for years, and with all the rumors about it being haunted, I figured nobody would mind me staying there to clear it up and sell off whatever was left. The farm was about 5 miles from the nearest town, isolated by woods that stretched into the kind of dark you only see out in the country. You couldn't even get a cell signal once you passed the last gas station, but I thought nothing of it. Quiet and alone. That was what I wanted. Or so I thought. The night started with this strange uneasiness that seemed to grow as the sun dipped below the tree line. I was hauling an old cabinet out of the barn when I first noticed it. This faint smell of rot, like something decaying nearby. The thing is, I'd been working around the place all day, and that smell hadn't been there before. But when I looked around, there was nothing. Just the empty fields and a creeping fog that seemed to rise from the ground out of nowhere, swallowing up the fence line in the distance. I ignored it, chalked it up to my nerves. But then, things started to happen. First, it was the sounds. While I was stacking up some old boxes in the barn, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the attic above. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. My heart hammered as I looked up, listening. I knew for a fact I was the only one there. The attic was barely accessible, just a dusty crawl space that hadn't seen light in years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there, watching. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the rickety ladder that led to the attic. I half expected to see a raccoon or a family of bats, but when I shone the light around, there was nothing. Just dust swirling in the beam, the stale air thick and unmoving. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye in the corner of the room. A pile of old yellowed papers, crumpled and stuffed between the rafters, like someone had tried to hide them there. I grabbed one and scanned it. It was a newspaper clipping from 1967, talking about a string of mysterious deaths that had taken place on the property. The headline read, "Local farmer and family disappear without a trace." My blood ran cold as I flipped through the rest of the clippings. There were dozens, all documenting strange occurrences on the farm. People going missing, crops withering overnight, animals found mutilated in ways too gruesome to describe. It seemed like every decade or so, something terrible happened here, each incident more horrifying than the last. And then, I heard it. A soft shuffling sound behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling, expecting to see nothing. But there was a shape in the shadows. A figure. It stood just at the edge of the light, its outline barely visible. For a second, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Then it moved. My heart lodged in my throat as I stared at the shape, too terrified to move. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were long and twisted, like tree branches bending at impossible angles. The more I looked, the clearer it became, though the edges of it still seemed to blur, like it was both there and not there at the same time. And that smell, it was stronger now, a mix of rot and earth, like a grave that had been freshly dug. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my balance as I fumbled down the ladder. The thing didn't follow. It just stood there, its head cocked to the side, watching me as I backed away. But I didn't dare turn my back on it until I was out of the barn. Outside, I took in huge gulps of fresh air, trying to steady myself. I told myself it was just the dark playing tricks, that I was letting the old stories and creepy clippings get to me. But deep down, I knew better. The farm felt different now, like it was alive, and I was trespassing. The wind picked up, rustling through the tall grass, and I swear I heard voices whispering through it, words I couldn't quite make out, soft and low, like an urgent warning or a chant. I tried to shake it off and head back to the house, but then, as I crossed the yard, I noticed something else. The fog, which had been light and patchy, was thick now, swirling around the house like it was alive, wrapping itself around the windows and doors. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me, but as I drew closer to the front porch, I realized something was wrong with the ground. The soil had turned wet, not just damp, but soaked, as though it had rained heavily, which it hadn't. I knelt down and touched it, and my fingers came away dark and sticky, smelling faintly of iron. Blood. The earth was wet with blood. I stumbled backward, my stomach churning as the metallic scent filled the air. I glanced at the farmhouse, and that's when I saw it. Through the upstairs window, something moved. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, staring up at the window. The shadow I'd seen moved closer to the glass, solidifying into a figure. It looked almost human, but something about it was deeply, impossibly wrong. It was as if someone had taken the shape of a person and twisted it in ways a body should never bend. The face, or what I thought was a face, was obscured, but I could see the glint of eyes staring down at me, cold and ancient. The house had been empty for years. I was sure of it. So how? Before I could process what was happening, the front door creaked open with an agonizingly slow groan. The fog spilled out of the doorway like it was alive, curling around my ankles, pulling at me as if it wanted me to go inside. I felt my legs move of their own accord, drawn forward against every instinct screaming at me to run. As I reached the door, I could see the interior was shrouded in shadows, darker than they should have been. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the same sickly scent of decay that filled the barn. I forced myself to step back, fighting the pull of that unnatural fog, and finally managed to turn away. I stumbled across the yard toward my truck, every nerve on fire. Just as I reached the truck door, I heard it. The faint sound of a child's laughter, drifting through the night. My blood turned to ice. There were no children here, no people for miles. But the laughter grew louder, echoing around me as if coming from every direction. It was high-pitched and mocking, like something playing a game I didn't understand. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling to get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart nearly stopped. Standing at the edge of the field, just barely visible in the dim glow of my taillights, was the figure from the window. It hadn't moved like a person. It was simply there, as if it had materialized out of the fog, its head tilted slowly, its eyes gleaming with something that felt ancient and hungry. The laughter stopped, replaced by a silence that pressed in on me from all sides, thick and suffocating. In that silence, I felt something shift, like the farm itself was waking up, aware of my presence, and it did not want me to leave. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The fog thinned as I sped away, but the feeling of being watched never left. I could still feel those eyes on me, watching from the shadows, following me as I drove mile after mile back toward town. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the farmhouse far behind me. But as I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, I saw a faint glow on the horizon, a soft pulse of light that looked almost like eyes. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew that whatever I'd disturbed on that land was far from done with me. I've never gone back to the farm. I don't think I could survive it if I did.
When I was 15, I had a summer job a few miles from my house. We lived in a rural, wooded area, and my parents were pretty strict about not letting me go into the woods alone. But since they both worked during the day, and my job started at noon, I had to walk to work. Against their rules and better judgment, I decided to take a shortcut through the woods instead of sticking to the road. It shaved about a mile off my walk, and I figured, what could go wrong? Every day, at the same time, I'd head out, walking through the deserted state forest. I followed a narrow deer path for about a mile until it connected to a set of railroad tracks. From there, I'd walk a couple more miles into town to get to my job. Looking back, yeah, it was a dumb move, but at 15, I didn't think much about it. The shortcut always gave me the creeps. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I convinced myself it was just paranoia. My parents were big on warning me about the dangers of the woods, and I assumed their voices in my head were making me uneasy. Still, it was cooler, shadier, and quicker than the road, so I ignored my gut and stuck with it. They had no idea I was doing this either. They'd pick me up after work, blissfully unaware of my little routine. For weeks, everything went fine, until one day. I was deep in the woods, about a mile away from any houses, when I spotted something on the trail ahead of me. 2 pages ripped out of a porn magazine, lying there on the path. They hadn't been there the day before. I froze. It wasn't just random trash, it was too deliberate. Someone had put them there, and given how deserted this area was, they had to be meant for me. My stomach dropped. I wanted to turn back, but at that point, it would have been a longer hike to get out of the woods the other way. Plus, I'd have to climb a huge hill to get back home, and there was no one around to help if anything went wrong. So I kept walking, my heart racing with every step. This part of the woods was thick with brambles, dogwood, and rolling hills, so it was hard to see very far in any direction. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but every time I stopped walking, the sound stopped too. It was faint, but distinct, like someone had loose change jingling in their pocket. Definitely not an animal. The thick trees and the way sound echoed made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I tried stopping again, just to test myself. And sure enough, as soon as I paused, the footsteps stopped too. That's when it hit me. I wasn't alone. I was being followed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my vision blurred with fear. But my instincts were crystal clear. Don't speak. Don't run. Just keep walking. I stuck to the dense deer path, heading further into the woods, my gut screaming not to look back. I didn't know why, but I could feel it. Someone was right behind me, close enough that I could sense them, but I refused to turn around. Now here's the thing. I'm short and on the chubby side. Always have been. If you saw me, you'd probably think I couldn't outrun anyone, let alone in the middle of the woods. And honestly, that's probably what this creep was thinking too. But here's what they didn't know. I ran cross-country and track back then. I wasn't Olympic material or anything, but I could do a 7-minute mile, and hills were my specialty. I always did well on hilly courses, so while I didn't consciously think through all of this in the moment, somewhere deep down, I knew. Don't run. Not yet. so I kept walking, further into the woods, trying to act like nothing was wrong. My legs felt like jelly. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and everything around me blurred like I was walking through a nightmare. It was a feeling I've never experienced before or since. A primal, you're prey right now kind of terror. I didn't scream. I didn't even glance back. I just knew nobody would hear me if I did. I headed toward the train tracks, which I knew weren't far off. They'd give me the space I needed to run. Clear ground, no branches to trip over. But the closer I got, the more I could feel them behind me. Just 5 or 10 feet back, following me like a shadow for what felt like forever. Maybe an eighth of a mile. Still, I didn't look back. I didn't even breathe differently. I just kept moving. As soon as the train tracks came into view, elevated on a gravel mound, I made my move. I bolted. Full speed. I scrambled up the hill on all fours, grabbing at weeds to haul myself up faster. And then I was sprinting along the tracks, lungs and legs burning, giving it everything I had. Behind me, I heard branches snapping in the woods below. I couldn't see who or what was there because the woods were so dark compared to the sunlight on the tracks. I just ran. I never actually saw the person, but I didn't need to. I knew their intentions were bad. Terrible, even. And after that, I never took the deer path shortcut again. I didn't tell my parents about it either. Not until I was 18 and out of the house. I was more scared of being grounded back then than I was of explaining what happened.